It was a quiet morning on June 30th, 2009, when a Parks Canada employee, making his routine rounds at Kingston Mills Locks in Ontario, stumbled upon something that would haunt the region forever: a submerged black Nissan Sentra resting in the still waters of the canal. When police divers arrived on the scene, they made a grim discovery. Inside the vehicle, 4 lifeless bodies floated, eerily preserved in the cold depths. The victims were identified as Zainab Shafia, 19, her younger sisters Sahar, 17, and Giti, 13, alongside their 52-year-old stepmom, Rona Amir Mohammed. At first glance, it seemed like a tragic accident, a late-night drive gone horribly wrong. But as investigators peeled back the layers of this unsettling case, they quickly realized that nothing about this scene was accidental. The circumstances were bizarre. Why were none of the victims wearing seatbelts? Why were the windows open in a vehicle that supposedly drove into the water by mistake? And most troubling of all, why did an eyewitness report seeing 2 cars at the water's edge that night? As the investigation unfolded, an even more chilling story began to emerge, one that involved deceit, obsession with family honor, and a plot so cold-blooded that it would grip an entire nation. Wealth, power, and twisted ideals would collide, leading to a case that many would call one of Canada's most shocking crimes. To the outside world, the Shafias appeared to be a family living the immigrant dream, successful, affluent, and well-settled in a new country. But behind closed doors, a different reality festered. A reality where strict patriarchal rules clashed with the modern freedoms embraced by the daughters, igniting a deadly family feud. What drove a father, a mother, and a brother to commit such an unthinkable act? What were the final moments like for those 4 women, trapped inside a vehicle? Was this truly about family honor, or something far more sinister? This is the story of the Shafia family murders, a tale that will send chills down your spine. If you're deeply emotional, please do not watch. Welcome to the Crime Series. I am glad to have you join us on another video. Kindly subscribe, like, and share. Let me know where you are watching from. Mohammed Shafia was born in the early 1950s in Kabul, Afghanistan, into a middle-class family. Though he never progressed beyond the 7th grade in formal schooling, he possessed an innate knack for business. Kabul, during Shafia's formative years, was a city undergoing rapid modernization. Entrepreneurs like him found ample opportunities to capitalize on the growing demand for consumer goods. Shafia, starting with a modest electronics shop, gradually built a thriving business by importing Panasonic radios and Peacock brand thermoses from Japan, establishing himself as a dominant figure in Kabul's burgeoning trade sector. Shafia's business success came with social prestige, and by the late 1970s, he was considered a wealthy man. However, in Afghan society, wealth alone was not enough. Family lineage, social standing, and adherence to cultural traditions played significant roles in one's status. It was within this context that Shafia's family arranged his marriage to Rona Amir, the daughter of a retired Afghan army colonel. The marriage, which took place in 1979, was seen as a strategic alliance, uniting 2 respected families. Rona was young, educated, and hopeful about her future, but she quickly realized that her primary role in the household would be to bear children, a role that fate would not grant her. After several years of marriage and numerous unsuccessful attempts to conceive, including fertility treatments in India, Rona remained childless. In Afghan culture, where large families are a source of pride and a measure of a man's legacy, this was a significant issue. Rona's inability to bear children created tension within the marriage, and it was her own suggestion that Shafia take a second wife, a common practice in Afghan society for men seeking heirs. Thus, in 1989, Shafia married Tuba Yahya, a 17-year-old girl from a family known to his mother. The second marriage marked a turning point in the Shafia household. While Rona outwardly accepted her role as the senior wife, caring for the household and helping raise the children born to Tuba, inwardly she felt increasingly sidelined. Tuba, fertile and ambitious, quickly established herself as the dominant figure in the household by bearing 7 children, 6 daughters and 1 son. As Tuba's influence grew, Rona's status diminished. By the early 1990s, the political climate in Afghanistan had become increasingly unstable. The Soviet invasion, followed by civil war, made life in Kabul dangerous, even for affluent families like the Shafias. Seeking safety and new business opportunities, Shafia moved his growing family to Pakistan and then briefly to Australia before finally settling in the United Arab Emirates. Dubai, a city experiencing a construction and economic boom, offered Shafia the perfect environment to expand his business empire. Muhammad Shafia's success as an entrepreneur in Dubai allowed him to lead a life of wealth and privilege, a lifestyle that stood in stark contrast to his modest beginnings in Kabul. In the United Arab Emirates, Shafia expanded his business empire beyond electronics, investing heavily in real estate and used car imports. His business acumen and ambition earned him significant respect in the Afghan expatriate community, where he was seen as a self-made man who had navigated the challenges of emigration and thrived in a competitive market. By the early 2000s, Shafia's family was living in a luxurious villa in one of Dubai's affluent neighborhoods. The children attended private international schools, where they were exposed to Western cultural influences, learning English and mingling with peers from various nationalities. Despite this exposure, the Shafia household remained firmly rooted in conservative Afghan traditions. Rona Amir, the first wife, played a complex role in this affluent yet rigid household. Although she had initially agreed to Shafia taking a second wife due to her infertility, she soon found herself overshadowed by Tuba, who bore the children Shafia so desperately wanted. In polygamous households like the Shafias, the balance of power often shifts toward the wife who provides heirs, and Rona's inability to conceive relegated her to a secondary status. According to later testimonies and Rona's own diary entries, her life in Dubai was marked by increasing isolation and emotional abuse. Tuba, younger and more assertive, gradually took control of the household, while Rona's role was reduced to that of a caretaker for Tuba's children. Despite the wealth and outward appearance of a happy family, Rona's personal writings reveal a woman trapped in a loveless marriage and marginalized in her own home. She described instances of verbal and psychological abuse, noting how Tuba would belittle her in front of the children, and how Shafia's affection was entirely directed toward his younger wife. During their years in Dubai, the Shafia children began to sense the underlying tensions in their home. Zainab, the eldest daughter, bore the brunt of her father's authoritarian rules. As she entered her teenage years, she started to question the strict expectations imposed on her, leading to frequent clashes with her parents. Despite her desire for freedom, Zainab was aware of the cultural expectations placed upon her, knowing that any perceived disobedience could bring shame upon the family. The family's wealth, however, afforded them privileges that most Afghans could only dream of. They traveled frequently, owned luxury vehicles, and lived in a home adorned with expensive furnishings. Shafia's status as a wealthy businessman ensured that the family was well connected within the Afghan expatriate community, and he often hosted lavish gatherings at their villa. To outsiders, the Shafias appeared to be the epitome of success. A prosperous businessman, a large and beautiful family, and a home filled with the trappings of wealth. Yet beneath the surface, the cracks in their family life continued to widen. Rona's increasing desperation was evident in her diary, where she expressed feelings of hopelessness and a longing for escape. She wrote of Tuba's manipulative tactics and how Shafia turned a blind eye to her suffering. Despite her subservient role, Rona feared that leaving the marriage would result in her losing all contact with the children she had helped raise. By 2007, Shafia began to consider the future of his children more seriously. Although Dubai had provided him with financial prosperity, it was not a place where he wanted his daughters to grow up. He believed that they would receive a better education and have more opportunities in the West, but he was equally determined to ensure they adhered to Afghan traditions. For Shafia, moving to Canada represented both an opportunity and a challenge. A chance to secure a brighter future for his family while maintaining the cultural values that defined his identity. The decision to immigrate was not without complications. Shafia was acutely aware that polygamy was illegal in Canada, and bringing both wives without arousing suspicion required careful planning. Tuba, the second wife, was listed as his legal wife, while Rona was presented as a cousin and domestic servant. This arrangement ensured that the family could move together, but it left Rona in a precarious legal position. Unlike Tuba, who was recognized as Shafia's spouse, Rona's status in Canada was dependent on a visitor visa that needed constant renewal. When the Shafia family arrived in Canada in June 2007, they carried with them high expectations and ambitions for their future. For Mohammed Shafia, the move symbolized a new chapter in his life, a chance to solidify his wealth in a stable country and provide his children with the educational opportunities he believed they needed to thrive. But beneath these hopeful aspirations lay a complicated web of cultural expectations, familial tensions, and a rigid adherence to patriarchal values that would ultimately turn the Canadian dream into a nightmare. The Shafias initially moved into a rental home in the St. Leonard borough of Montreal. Used to the spacious luxury of their villa in Dubai, the cramped quarters were a significant adjustment for the family. Shafia, eager to recreate the grandeur of their former life, immediately began construction on a custom-built mansion in the affluent suburb of Brossard. The house, with its multiple bedrooms and expensive furnishings, was meant to showcase Shafia's success and provide ample space for his large family. Despite the outward appearance of prosperity, life within the Shafia household was far from ideal. The move to Canada did little to alleviate the underlying tensions that had plagued the family in Dubai. Shafia's authoritarian parenting style remained unchanged, and the children, particularly the girls, found themselves caught between two conflicting worlds: the traditional Afghan values enforced by their father and the more liberal Western ideals they encountered at school and in society. Zainab, the eldest daughter, was the first to openly rebel. Having spent her formative years under the strict control of her father, she saw the move to Canada as an opportunity to assert her independence. She began dressing in a more Western style, socializing with classmates, and expressing an interest in dating. Actions that, to her parents, were seen as dishonorable and shameful. For Shafia, who viewed his daughters as the bearers of the family's honor, Zainab's behavior was a direct threat to his reputation. Her rebellion reached a peak when she formed a romantic relationship with a Pakistani boy, something her parents vehemently opposed. In response, Shafia tightened his grip, forbidding Zainab from seeing her boyfriend and enforcing stricter rules at home. The tensions between father and daughter escalated, with frequent arguments and emotional outbursts becoming a regular occurrence in the household. Sahar, the second eldest daughter, was also struggling with the expectations imposed upon her. While not as openly defiant as Zainab, she harbored her own dreams of freedom and independence. She confided in friends and teachers about the oppressive environment at home, even hinting at suicidal thoughts. Sahar's teachers later testified that she often appeared distressed and withdrawn, and that she had expressed a desire to escape her family's control. Giti, the youngest of the three daughters, was perhaps the most outspoken. Just 13 years old at the time, she was known for her spirited nature and refusal to conform to her father's expectations. Unlike her older sisters, Giti had little interest in adhering to traditional Afghan customs. She frequently skipped school, dressed in trendy clothing, and openly voiced her dissatisfaction with the rules imposed by her parents. Her rebellious nature made her a frequent target of her father's anger, and she often found herself at the center of family disputes. While the girls grappled with the pressures of living in two conflicting cultures, Rona's situation grew increasingly dire. Still legally unrecognized as Shafia's wife, she relied entirely on his goodwill to maintain her residency status in Canada. Isolated and marginalized, Rona's only source of comfort was the children she had helped raise. But even they could not shield her from the emotional abuse she endured at the hands of Tuba and Shafia. By 2008, the Shafia family dynamic had become increasingly volatile. Teachers, social workers, and even the police became aware of the issues at home. Zainab ran away to a women's shelter at one point, prompting Shafia to call the police and report her as missing. When she returned home, the family presented a united front to outsiders, claiming that everything was fine. But behind closed doors, the tensions continued to simmer. Child welfare services were called in on multiple occasions, but each time, the family managed to deflect scrutiny. Sahar and Giti, Both expressed a desire to be placed in foster care, citing the oppressive environment at home, but without concrete evidence of physical abuse. Authorities were unable to intervene. In hindsight, these missed opportunities to protect the girls would prove to be tragic. As tensions continued to escalate, Shafia's obsession with honor grew more pronounced. He began voicing his frustrations more openly, lamenting the behavior of his daughters and the shame he believed they had brought upon the family. To Shafia, their defiance was not just a personal betrayal, but a public humiliation that required drastic action. He began speaking of honor and punishment in increasingly ominous terms, giving hints to the tragic events to come. By mid-2009, the signs of a brewing storm were impossible to ignore. The family's internal struggles had reached a critical point, and the threat of violence loomed large. Despite the girls' cries for help and the mounting concerns of those around them, the Shafias remained isolated in their turmoil, bound by a rigid code of honor that placed reputation above all else. In late June 2009, Mohammed Shafia announced a family road trip, a supposed summer vacation that was intended to strengthen familial bonds amidst the brewing tensions. However, this trip was not merely about sightseeing or relaxation. Unbeknownst to the Shafia sisters and Rona, this journey was the culmination of their father's obsession with restoring his family's honor. The family, split between two vehicles, a silver Lexus SUV and a newly purchased black Nissan Sentra, set out on June 23, 2009. Their intended destination was Niagara Falls, a popular tourist attraction. Zainab, Sahar, Giti, and Rona rode in the Nissan, while Shafia, his wife Tuba, and their son Hamed drove the Lexus. The younger children remained under the watchful eye of their parents. Throughout the trip, Sahar stayed connected with her boyfriend Ricardo Sanchez, exchanging numerous text messages. Her phone activity provided police investigators with a detailed timeline of the family's movements later on.
As we go into the most intense part of this video, kindly like and subscribe to this channel. It gives me motivation to create more videos. If you love this video and wish to see more, kindly subscribe.
Friends of the girls later described how excited the sisters seemed about the vacation. During the trip, tensions remained high. Zainab, who had recently attempted to assert her independence by marrying a boy against her parents' wishes, was under close scrutiny. The marriage, hastily annulled within a day, had deeply embarrassed the Shafia family, and Shafia's resentment toward his daughter continued to fester. Rona, who had confided to relatives about her fears for her life, was also a target of Shafia's wrath. Despite her marginalized role within the family, she had remained a constant support figure for the girls, which likely made her an additional threat to Shafia's control. After a few days in Niagara Falls, the family checked out of their motel on June 29, 2009. A surveillance camera captured Hamed paying for the rooms in cash. The exact details of what happened next remain speculative, but evidence gathered during the investigation provided a chilling narrative of the events leading to the deaths. According to the prosecution's theory, the family drove east toward Kingston, Ontario, with the intention of staging a fatal accident at the Kingston Mills Locks. The scenic but secluded location was chosen deliberately. It provided the perfect setting for what Shafia and his accomplices hoped would be perceived as a tragic mishap. At approximately 1:30 a.m. on June 30th, the Shafias arrived at the locks. Shafia, Tuba, and Hamed acted together to carry out their plan. The girls and Rona, likely unaware of the danger they were in, were either asleep or incapacitated when the car was driven to the edge of the water. Investigators later discovered that the Nissan had been carefully maneuvered into position before being pushed into the canal. Marks on the bumper of the Nissan matched the damage found on the front of the Lexus, suggesting that the SUV was used to force the sedan into the water. The vehicle plunged into the canal, sinking quickly with its occupants trapped inside. After the deed was done, Shafia, Tuba, and Hamed drove to a nearby motel, where they checked in for a few hours of rest. The younger children were left sleeping in the Lexus, oblivious to the horrific events that had just unfolded. On the morning of June 30th, 2009, a routine inspection at the Kingston Mills Locks turned into a horrific scene. A Parks Canada employee noticed the roof of a submerged vehicle just beneath the surface of the canal water. Alarmed, he immediately alerted the authorities, setting off a chain of events that would ultimately lead to one of the most high-profile murder cases in Canadian history. By mid-morning, local police and rescue teams had arrived at the scene. The murky waters of the canal obscured much of the vehicle, but as divers descended into the water, the grim reality of the situation became apparent. Inside the black Nissan Sentra were the lifeless bodies of 4 females: Zainab, Sahar, Geeti, and Rona. The positioning of the bodies suggested that they had been trapped and unable to escape as the car quickly filled with water. Divers reported that the windows of the Nissan were open, a detail that immediately raised suspicions among investigators. Why would the windows be open during what was supposed to be a routine drive, or, as the Shafia family later claimed, a joyride gone wrong? Moreover, none of the victims were wearing seatbelts, a fact that seemed incongruous with the theory of a spontaneous nighttime drive. Autopsies conducted on the victims confirmed that the cause of death for all 4 was drowning. However, the examination revealed another disturbing detail. 3 of the victims had bruising on the tops of their heads. This finding indicated that they may have been struck before being submerged, adding weight to the theory that foul play was involved. While rescue efforts were underway, Mohammed Shafia, Tuba Yahya, and their son Hamid arrived at the Kingston police station to file a missing persons report. According to their account, the girls had taken the Nissan sometime during the night without permission. They claimed to have no knowledge of their whereabouts and appeared anxious for any news. At face value, their story seemed plausible: teenagers sneaking out for a late-night drive, only to end up in a tragic accident. However, as detectives delved deeper into their statements, inconsistencies began to emerge. Detective Constable Jeff Dempster, who was assigned to interview the family members, noted the peculiar behavior of Hamid. Despite learning about the deaths of his sisters and stepmother, Hamid showed little emotion. He seemed unusually calm, offering vague explanations for his actions on the night in question. He claimed that after the family checked into a motel in Kingston, he had driven back to Montreal alone to retrieve a forgotten laptop. When pressed further, his story began to unravel. The supposed reason for his sudden departure seemed flimsy, and investigators grew increasingly suspicious. Adding to the mystery was Hamid's report of a minor accident in Montreal that same morning. He had called the police to report that he had accidentally hit a utility pole while parking the Lexus SUV. However, when officers examined the damage to the vehicle, they noticed that it was inconsistent with the description Hamid had provided. The impact marks suggested a different kind of collision, one that matched the damage found on the rear bumper of the submerged Nissan. Back at the scene of the incident, forensic investigators meticulously combed the area for evidence. They discovered fragments of a shattered headlight near the edge of the canal, which they later determined belonged to the Lexus. This critical piece of evidence indicated that the Lexus had been used to push the Nissan into the water. The position of the Nissan, as well as the absence of skid marks or signs of braking, further supported the theory that the vehicle had been deliberately driven into the canal. As the investigation progressed, police uncovered more troubling information about life inside the Shafia household. Teachers, social workers, and neighbors came forward with accounts of the girls' struggles and the oppressive environment they endured. Zainab's attempt to escape by marrying her boyfriend without her parents' consent, Sahar's suicide attempt, and Geeti's rebellious behavior painted a picture of a family in turmoil. Detectives also learned about previous interventions by child welfare services. Despite multiple reports of abuse and violence, no long-term action had been taken. These revelations added weight to the theory that the girls had been living in fear and that their deaths were not accidental. The turning point in the investigation came when police obtained a warrant to place wiretaps on the Shafia family's home and vehicles. Over the course of several weeks, investigators recorded numerous conversations that provided crucial insights into the family's mindset. In one particularly chilling exchange, Mohammed Shafia was heard lamenting the loss of his honor and expressing satisfaction that his daughters were dead. "They betrayed us," he said. "They brought shame to our family. May they rot in hell." These recordings, combined with the physical evidence and eyewitness accounts, painted a damning picture of premeditated murder. It became clear that the deaths were not the result of a tragic accident, but a calculated act of violence driven by a twisted sense of family honor. On July 23, 2009, the police made their move. Armed with arrest warrants, officers apprehended Mohammed Shafia, Tuba Yahya, and Hamed Shafia. They were charged with 4 counts of first-degree murder and conspiracy to commit murder. The morning of the arrests unfolded with quiet precision. Kingston police officers, accompanied by members of the tactical unit, arrived at the Shafia family's lavish Montreal home. The family was caught by surprise, unaware that their every move over the past few weeks had been closely monitored. Officers handcuffed the 3 suspects, while social workers took custody of the remaining children, ensuring their safety. In the days following the arrests, authorities held a press conference to inform the public of the charges. News of the so-called honor killings sent shockwaves across Canada, sparking widespread outrage and debate about cultural practices, integration, and the rights of women and girls in immigrant communities. For many Canadians, it was unthinkable that such an atrocity could occur in their country. In the weeks leading up to the trial, defense attorneys for the accused began formulating their strategy. They would argue that the deaths were the result of a tragic accident and that any incriminating statements made by the suspects were taken out of context or mistranslated. Despite the gravity of the charges, Mohammed Shafia remained defiant. "We are not murderers," he declared to reporters. "This is all lies. We loved our children." Tuba Yahya, too, maintained her innocence, portraying herself as a grieving mother who had lost her beloved daughters. "I am a mother," she said in a tearful interview. "How could I kill my own children?" Hamed, the eldest son, stayed largely silent, his lawyers advising him to refrain from making public statements. However, privately recorded conversations revealed a young man deeply loyal to his father's worldview, willing to go to great lengths to protect the family's honor. The legal proceedings moved swiftly, with prosecutors confident in their case. "This was not an accident," lead prosecutor Gerard Larheis said during a pretrial hearing. "This was a premeditated act carried out with the cold-blooded intent to murder 4 innocent women." As the trial date approached, media interest in the case intensified. Journalists from across Canada and beyond descended on Kingston, eager to cover what was shaping up to be one of the most sensational trials in the country's history. The Shafia case was more than just a murder trial. It was a cultural flashpoint, forcing Canadians to confront uncomfortable questions about honor, family, and the integration of immigrant communities into Western society. The trial of Mohammed Shafia, Tuba Yahya, and Hamed Shafia began in October 2011 at the Frontenac County Courthouse in Kingston, Ontario. It was a trial unlike any other, conducted in 4 languages: English, French, Dari, and Spanish. The courtroom was packed with journalists, activists, and members of the public, all eager to witness the unfolding of a case that had captured national attention. Crown prosecutors Laurie Lasselle and Gerard Larheis presented a compelling case, meticulously outlining the events leading up to the murders. They called on 58 witnesses, including teachers, social workers, and police officers, who testified about the abuse and control exerted by Shafia over his family. One of the most powerful pieces of evidence was the wiretap recordings. In one recording, Shafia was heard saying, "They committed treason from beginning to end. They betrayed kindness. They betrayed Islam. They betrayed our tradition." These words left little doubt about his motive and intent. Witness after witness took the stand, painting a picture of a household ruled by fear and oppression. Teachers testified about how the girls confided in them, expressing their desire to escape their controlling father. Social workers recounted the numerous calls they received from the Shafia daughters, pleading for help. Perhaps the most heartbreaking testimony came from relatives of Rona Amir. Her sister, Diba Masumi, tearfully recounted how Rona had confided in her about the abuse she endured and her fear for her life. "She told me, if anything happens to me, it will be Shafia," Masumi said. As the prosecution presented a mountain of damning evidence against Mohammed Shafia, Tuba Yahya, and Hamid Shafia, the defense faced an uphill battle. With wiretap recordings, forensic evidence, and testimony painting a grim picture of premeditated murder, the defense attorneys knew they had to craft a strategy that would cast reasonable doubt in the minds of the jurors. The defense team's approach was multifaceted, relying on three key tactics: portraying the Shafias as a close-knit, loving family, challenging the legitimacy of the wiretap recordings, and suggesting that the deaths were a tragic accident rather than a deliberate act. Throughout the trial, defense lawyers attempted to humanize the accused and present them as a family in mourning. Peter Kemp, the attorney representing Mohammed Shafia, repeatedly emphasized his client's role as a hardworking father who had sacrificed much to provide a better life for his children. Kemp argued that, despite cultural differences, Shafia deeply loved his daughters and would never harm them. "This is a man who built a life from nothing," Kemp told the jury. "He invested in his children's future, gave them a privileged life, and sought only their happiness." Kemp further pointed to photographs of the families smiling together on vacations and during social gatherings, suggesting that such images were inconsistent with the idea of an abusive household. David Crow, representing Tuba Yahya, focused on her role as a devoted mother. He painted Tuba as a woman torn apart by grief, emphasizing her emotional outbursts during the trial and her tearful denials of any involvement in the deaths. "She is a mother who has lost her children," Crow said. "She is not a murderer. She is a victim of this tragedy." Patrick McCann, defending Hamid, attempted to depict him as a loyal son who was caught in the middle of a terrible situation. He described Hamid as a young man who made foolish decisions but did not have the capacity to commit such a heinous crime. One of the most damaging pieces of evidence presented by the prosecution was the series of wiretap recordings in which Shafia could be heard cursing his daughters and expressing no remorse over their deaths. In these recordings, Shafia referred to his daughters as whores and claimed that their deaths had cleansed the family's honor. The defense sought to discredit these recordings by arguing that they were taken out of context and mistranslated. Kemp called upon a linguistics expert who testified that certain Dari expressions used by Shafia did not have direct equivalents in English and could have been misinterpreted. For example, the infamous phrase about the devil shitting on their graves was argued to be a common, though harsh, idiomatic expression in Afghan culture that did not literally imply hatred. Furthermore, the defense suggested that the wiretap evidence was being used unfairly to paint Shafia as a monster, rather than to prove that he committed a crime. "The words may be harsh," Kemp argued, "but harsh words do not equate to murder." Despite their efforts, the defense's narrative was riddled with inconsistencies. The timeline of events did not align with phone records and surveillance footage presented by the prosecution. The theory that the girls had gone for a joyride was undermined by testimony from friends and family who stated that none of the victims knew how to drive, let alone operate a car, on a dark and unfamiliar road. As the defense wrapped up their case, it was evident that their strategy had not resonated with many in the courtroom. Observers noted that jurors appeared skeptical, especially during the accident theory presentation. The defense's attempt to blame cultural misunderstandings and mistranslations for Shafia's inflammatory remarks also failed to fully convince the jury. In her closing remarks, Crown Prosecutor Lori Lascelles dismantled the defense's arguments, reminding the jury of the overwhelming evidence pointing to premeditation. "This was not an accident," she said firmly. "This was a deliberate, calculated act carried out to restore a twisted sense of honor." Despite the defense's best efforts, the prosecution's case had been too strong, too meticulously built to be unraveled. The stage was set for the jury to deliberate and deliver their chilling verdict. After months of meticulous investigation and weeks of emotional courtroom drama, the Shafia trial reached its climax in January 2012. The prosecution, led by Gerard Larhouse and Lori Lascelles, presented an airtight case built on a combination of forensic evidence, eyewitness testimony, and, most damning of all, the wiretap recordings. The defense attempted to sow doubt, claiming the deaths were accidental, and that cultural misunderstandings had played a role in how their clients' words were interpreted. However, the evidence was too overwhelming for the jury to ignore. The court had heard harrowing testimony from a long list of witnesses. As the jury deliberated, the atmosphere inside the courthouse was tense. Journalists and spectators speculated about the outcome, while the families of the victims waited in anguish. After 15 hours of deliberation spread over 2 days, the jury returned with its verdict: guilty on all 4 counts of first-degree murder for Mohammed Shafia, Tuba Yahya, and Hamid Shafia. When the verdict was read aloud, a collective silence swept through the courtroom. Mohammed Shafia remained defiant, declaring in Dari, "We are not criminals. We are not murderers. This is unjust." Tuba wept but echoed her husband's sentiment, proclaiming her innocence. Hamid, stoic as ever, uttered only a few words: "I did not drown my sisters." Despite their protests, it was clear to everyone in the courtroom, and to the millions following the case across the country, that justice had been served. Justice Robert Maranger addressed the convicted trio before sentencing them to life in prison, without the possibility of parole for 25 years. In his final remarks, he did not mince words. "It is difficult to conceive of a more heinous, more despicable, more honorless crime," he said. The apparent reason behind these cold-blooded, shameful murders was that the 4 completely innocent victims offended your twisted notion.
Loved what you saw? Like, subscribe, and turn on notifications to join our growing community. Your support keeps us creating.